Her palm connected with my cheek in the exact second the announcer called our son's name, the two sounds landing so close together that for a moment I genuinely couldn't separate them in my memory. The crack of her hand and the sound of Tyler, and just Tyler, no last name yet, floating out over 400 folding chairs on a football field in June. "You'll never be his real mother," she said, loud enough that the row behind us went completely silent, loud enough that I heard someone 2 seats down inhale sharply. Marcus grabbed her wrist a second too late, which is the kind of detail that sounds small until you've lived inside the actual second it happened. Tyler was already halfway across the stage by then, diploma folder in his hand, and I watched his head turn, just slightly, toward the sound instead of toward the podium where he was supposed to be shaking the superintendent's hand. He'd heard it. He'd seen enough. He kept walking, because 18 years of being raised well enough to keep walking through hard things doesn't disappear in a single moment. But I watched something in his shoulders change, a bracing I recognized because I'd spent 6 years learning what that particular posture looked like on him. And 3 feet away, close enough that I could see her jaw tighten, stood the principal, a woman named Adias Akafor, a wireless microphone still clipped to the lapel of her blazer from the welcome remarks she'd given 20 minutes earlier. She had seen all of it, not heard about it secondhand, not pieced it together from a commotion in the stands. Seen it, directly, 3 feet away, in the middle of a ceremony she was legally and professionally responsible for. "My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 39 years old, and until that Thursday evening in June, I believed I had finally reached something like peace with my husband's ex-wife. 6 years into a relationship with a woman who had never once made that peace easy, but who I'd assumed, wrongly, had at least reached her ceiling of what she was willing to do in public. I need to back up, because the slap itself, as shocking as it was never really the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been building for almost a year, and if you don't understand what came before it, the part that happened after won't make sense either. Marcus and Denise divorced when Tyler was 7, well before I ever entered the picture. I met Marcus 4 years later, married him 2 years after that, and became, in every practical sense that matters, a second consistent adult in Tyler's life, someone who went to his soccer games and helped with his college applications and sat up with him the night before his SATs, quizzing him on vocabulary words neither of us fully remembered by morning. I never tried to replace Denise. I want to be honest about that, because it's relevant to what happened on that stage. I never once referred to myself as his mother, corrected him if he called me by my first name in front of her, or pushed for any role beyond the one Tyler himself, over years, had slowly and on his own decided to give me. By the time he was 15, he'd started calling me Nessa, a name he'd invented himself, distinct from anything he called Denise, and I'd never asked for more than that. Denise had never fully accepted any of it. Not the marriage, not the years, not the soccer games. For most of that time, her resistance stayed at the level of coldness rather than confrontation, the kind of thing you learn to navigate around rather than address directly. Because addressing it directly always seemed to make things worse for Tyler, caught in the middle of 2 households that couldn't quite agree on how much space I was allowed to take up in his life. Need to men's were smaller signs over the years, if I'm honest, that I'd chosen mostly to overlook rather than escalate. Denise would sometimes schedule things at the last minute that conflicted with events she knew I'd planned to attend, then express surprise when I mentioned the overlap. She referred to me, for years, as Marcus's wife, rather than by my name, even directly to Tyler. A habit he eventually started gently correcting on his own without either of us asking him to. At a middle school orientation once, she'd introduced herself to a new teacher as Tyler's mother, full stop. Then turned to me and introduced me, with a small, careful pause, as a family friend. I'd let that one go too, the way I'd let most of it go, because Tyler was standing right there each time, and I never wanted my own discomfort to become something he had to manage on my behalf. What changed? About 8 months before the graduation, was a custody modification petition Denise filed, seeking to reduce Marcus's parenting time and, more specifically, to add a condition that I not be present for any of Tyler's medical appointments, school conferences, or what the petition called significant life events, a phrase her attorney had used that Marcus's lawyer later told us was unusually broad and unusually aimed, not at limiting Marcus's role, but specifically at limiting mine. The petition's stated basis was that I represented, in Denise's words, an unstable and inappropriate influence, a phrase she supported with almost nothing beyond her own characterization of a handful of interactions over the years, most of which Marcus's lawyer was eventually able to show had been misrepresented or taken out of context. It was, by any honest reading, a weak petition. But weak petitions still cost money to fight, still require depositions and character statements and months of waiting for court dates, and still take a real toll on the people living inside the uncertainty while a judge decides whether to take them seriously. Those 8 months were harder on our household than I think I fully let myself acknowledge at the time. Marcus spent evenings on calls with his attorney that he tried, not always successfully, to keep out of earshot of Tyler. I sat for a deposition myself in April, answering an attorney's questions for nearly 3 hours about interactions I barely remembered, framed in ways that made ordinary parenting moments sound, in the retelling, far more sinister than they'd ever felt while actually living through them. He asked me, at one point, to describe in detail a disagreement Tyler and I had once had over a curfew when he was 15, a completely unremarkable teenage argument that had resolved itself within a day, and I watched the attorney try to shape my own account of it into something resembling instability, a pattern of control, language that had nothing to do with the actual small, forgettable evening it was describing. I remember driving home from that deposition and sitting in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to walk inside and pretend the afternoon had been ordinary, because Tyler had a chemistry test that night and I didn't want my own exhaustion to become something else he had to carry. Tyler was 17 through most of that process, old enough to understand roughly what was happening, though Marcus and I had tried hard to keep the worst of the details away from him, an effort that I think mostly succeeded, though I've since learned that teenagers absorb far more of a household's tension than they let on, even when the specifics stay hidden. The hearing had been scheduled, coincidentally and unfortunately, for the week after graduation. I think that timing matters for understanding what happened on that stage, because I believe, though I can't prove it, that Denise walked into that ceremony already carrying the particular kind of desperation that comes from knowing your case is weak and your court date is close. I hadn't spoken to her directly in months by the time graduation arrived, communicating only through the co-parenting app Marcus and Denise had used for years, the kind that logs every message with a timestamp neither party can later dispute. Graduation seating had been arranged, awkwardly, the way it always was for shared events. Denise and her current husband on one side of the aisle, Marcus and I on the other, close enough to see each other, far enough to avoid direct interaction. It had worked at every previous milestone. It did not work that evening. I still don't know exactly what triggered it in the moment. Marcus thinks it was watching Tyler walk across the stage and instinctively looking toward me, the way he sometimes did at moments that mattered, a small habitual glance that had nothing behind it beyond years of shared history, but that Denise, sitting close enough to see it happen in real time, apparently read as some final confirmation of exactly the fear her petition had been built around. Whatever the reason, she stood up from her folding chair, crossed the narrow gap between our sections, and hit me across the face hard enough that my ears rang for several seconds afterward, hard enough that I stumbled sideways into the woman next to me before Marcus's hand closed around Denise's wrist. Principal Okafor moved fast, faster than I would have expected from someone who'd spent the previous 20 minutes delivering calm, practiced remarks about resilience and the class of that year's particular strengths. She stepped between us before Marcus had fully let go of Denise's wrist, said something quiet and firm to both of us about stepping to the side of the stage area, and then, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has clearly had to manage far worse in a career spent running a large public high school, signaled to two staff members near the sound booth to continue the ceremony without a visible interruption to the 200 remaining students still waiting for their names to be called. An eternity spent standing off to the side of the football field with an ice pack someone from the nurse's office had produced from somewhere, while Principal Okafor took statements, first from me, then from Marcus, then, separately, from Denise, in a small equipment room usually used for storing band instruments during the school year. I to describe what those 40 minutes felt like, because I think they matter more than the slap itself in some ways. I stood there watching the rest of the ceremony continue at a careful distance, names I didn't recognize called out one after another, applause rising and falling in waves, while my own son's graduation, the one I'd watched him prepare for over 4 years of homework and college applications, and one very memorable prom dress disaster, had already effectively ended for me in the space of a single sound. A woman I didn't know, another parent, brought me a cup of water at some point during that wait, without saying much, just pressing it into my hand and giving my shoulder a brief squeeze before returning to her seat. I don't know her name. I've thought about her more than once since, the particular kindness of a stranger who understood, correctly, that I didn't need conversation in that moment, just some small evidence that someone had noticed. Marcus stood beside me mostly in silence, his jaw tight, occasionally glancing toward the equipment room where Denise had been taken, though he never once suggested we leave before Tyler's ceremony had fully concluded, understanding, I think, that leaving would have felt like abandoning the very thing we'd come to witness in the first place. When Tyler finally found us afterward, still in his cap and gown, diploma folder tucked awkwardly under one arm, he didn't say much at first. He looked at the side of my face, which had already started to swell slightly along the cheekbone, and something moved across his expression that I recognized immediately. Not anger exactly, something closer to a kind of exhausted clarity. The look of someone finally seeing plainly a pattern he'd probably sensed for a long time, without ever having proof of its full shape. "I saw her do it," he said, "before I even got to the podium. I saw the whole thing." I told him I was okay, which was mostly true, physically at least. He didn't say much else that night, which worried me more than if he'd said a great deal. Marcus and I let him have the space, understanding that a graduation night that should have belonged entirely to him had instead become, in its final act, something entirely about the adults around him. Principal Okafor called us 2 days later, once she'd completed what she described as the district's required incident documentation for any physical altercation occurring during a school-sponsored event on school property. She explained, in careful procedural language, that district policy required a written incident report regardless of anyone's personal preference about whether to formally pursue anything further, that the report would include her own eyewitness account as a staff member present at the time, and that the ceremony, as was standard for graduations at that school, had been recorded on video for the district's archive, footage that clearly captured the incident from an angle near the stage. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "This isn't a situation where I have discretion to simply let it go unrecorded. A physical assault occurred at a school event, witnessed directly by school staff. The report exists now, on file, whether or not you personally choose to pursue anything with the police or in family court. I wanted you to know that before you heard it secondhand." She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the district's policy required her to notify us of our right to request a copy of the incident report and the relevant portion of the event footage, a detail that struck me at the time as a strange kind of bureaucratic kindness, an administrator making sure that two exhausted parents understood exactly what paperwork existed and how to access it, in the middle of what was, for her, presumably just one more procedural obligation among many that week. I hadn't fully considered, until that call, what an official, time-stamped, staff-witnessed incident report might mean beyond its immediate function as a matter of school record. It was Marcus's lawyer, when we called her that same afternoon, who explained the fuller picture. "This changes your custody hearing significantly," she said. "Denise's entire petition is built around the claim that Vanessa represents an unstable, inappropriate influence on Tyler. She now has a documented, staff-witnessed, likely recorded incident of assaulting Vanessa in front of Tyler at his own graduation. That's not a detail a family court judge is going to treat as neutral. If anything, it inverts the entire premise of her petition." I didn't feel triumphant hearing that, which surprised me a little at the time. I felt mostly tired and something close to sad, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate until later. Whatever satisfaction there might have been in watching Denise's own case collapse under the weight of her own actions was outweighed, for me, by the plainer fact that my son had watched his stepmother get hit in the middle of the proudest moment of his young life so far, and that no legal outcome, however favorable, was going to undo the specific damage of that image sitting somewhere in his memory now, permanently. Now, the custody hearing, when it happened a week later, was shorter than any of us expected. Denise's attorney requested, and was granted, a short continuance to address what he called new developments, which everyone in the room understood to mean the graduation incident, now formally part of the record through Principal Okafor's report, and, more significantly, through footage from the ceremony's official recording, which Marcus's lawyer had already subpoenaed as evidence. I wasn't present for the hearing itself, on my lawyer's advice, since I wasn't formally a party to the custody matter, only a witness and, now, a victim of record. Marcus described it to me afterward, sitting at our kitchen table with a level of quiet that told me the whole thing had drained something out of him he wasn't going to easily recover. He said Denise had looked smaller in the courtroom than he remembered her looking in years, seated beside her attorney in a gray suit, not making eye contact with him across the room the way she usually did out of some mixture of habit and defiance. Her attorney had requested the continuance almost immediately, before the judge had even finished reviewing the morning's docket, and Marcus said you could see, in the small, private exchange between Denise and her lawyer just before the request, the exact moment she understood that the footage existed and that fighting it would only make things worse. The judge granted the continuance without much comment, the kind of procedural moment that probably looked unremarkable to anyone watching from the gallery, but that Marcus said felt, sitting there, like watching a wall come down all at once after months of it slowly cracking. Denise's petition, the one seeking to reduce his parenting time and restrict my presence at significant events, was withdrawn before the judge even needed to rule on it, on the advice, Marcus assumed, of her own attorney once the footage had been reviewed. In its place, a new, separate matter had opened, this one addressing the incident itself directly, one that Marcus's lawyer said could reasonably result in a formal no-contact provision between Denise and me at any future events involving Tyler, along with whatever consequences the district or local authorities decided to pursue independently regarding the assault itself, which remained, procedurally, a separate matter from the family court proceedings entirely. I didn't pursue criminal charges, in the end, though I want to be honest that I considered it seriously for several days before deciding against it. My reasoning had less to do with forgiveness than with a clear-eyed assessment of what Tyler actually needed going into his first year of college that fall, which was not a criminal case involving his mother playing out over the following months while he was trying to adjust to a new school 3 states away. I told Marcus's lawyer I wanted the civil and custody consequences to stand on their own, documented and real, without adding a criminal proceeding on top of it. She respected that, though she made sure I understood I could revisit the decision later if I changed my mind, since the statute of limitations gave me time I wasn't required to use immediately. I talked it through with Marcus more than once during those days, weighing it out loud the way you do with a decision you know will be permanent once it's made. He told me he'd support whatever I decided, and meant it, though I could tell some part of him wanted me to press charges, some protective instinct that hadn't fully settled since the moment his hand had closed a second too late around Denise's wrist. I understood that instinct. I didn't share it fully, not because what happened mattered less to me, but because I'd started to think less about punishing Denise and more about what kind of ongoing presence I wanted this entire episode to have in Tyler's life during a year that was supposed to be about him starting something new, not about the adults around him working through the fallout of one terrible evening. Tyler and I had the real conversation about all of it almost 2 weeks after graduation, sitting on the back porch one evening while Marcus was inside dealing with a work call. He'd been quieter than usual in the days since, understandably, and I'd been giving him space rather than pushing, though I'd started to worry the space was becoming its own kind of avoidance. "I keep thinking about it while I'm trying to fall asleep," he said, not looking at me directly, focused instead on a spot somewhere out in the yard. "Not just that she hit you, that she said that thing about you never being my real mother, like she gets to decide that." "She doesn't get to decide that," I said. "Nobody gets to decide who somebody is to you except you. I've never once needed the word mother to know what the last 6 years have meant to me, or, I hope, to you." "I know," he said. "I've known that for a long time. I think that's part of why it made me so angry. Like she said it because she was scared it wasn't true anymore. Not because it was." I asked him, carefully, whether he wanted to talk to someone about it, a counselor, not because I thought there was anything wrong with how he was processing it, but because I didn't want him to feel like he had to carry the weight of that evening entirely on his own before heading off to school in the fall. He said he'd think about it, and a few weeks later, on his own, he mentioned he'd found someone through the campus health center he planned to check in with once the semester started. A small piece of information he offered almost casually, the way 18-year-olds often deliver the things that actually matter most, folded into ordinary conversation instead of announced. Dumb. And Viniana correct him or expand on that first exchange, because I think he'd already arrived, on his own, at something true enough that it didn't need my help to stand on its own. We sat there a while longer without saying much else, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, and at some point he leaned his head briefly against my shoulder, the way he used to do as a much younger boy, before it stopped being something teenagers do, before that particular evening apparently made it something worth doing again, just once, before he headed off in the fall to a life increasingly further away from both his parents' households. Denise and I have not spoken since that night on the football field. Communication now runs entirely through the co-parenting app and, where relevant, through the lawyers, a formality that I think suits both of us better than the strained politeness we'd been performing at shared events for years anyway. Marcus tells me she's expressed, secondhand through her own attorney, something resembling regret, though it's never reached me directly, and I've stopped waiting for it to. Some apologies matter less once the actual consequences have already done the work an apology was supposed to do. Marcus has his own relationship with Denise to manage still, separate from mine, since they'll remain connected for the rest of their lives through Tyler regardless of anything that happened at that graduation. He's told me it's strained in a new way now, more formal, more careful, the two of them speaking almost exclusively about logistics, drop-off times, tuition payments, the practical machinery of co-parenting an adult child who technically no longer requires either of them to coordinate much of anything. I think some part of him grieves the version of their relationship that existed before that evening, even a difficult, imperfect version, because it had at least allowed for some shared warmth around Tyler's milestones. That warmth is gone now, and I don't think either of them expects it back. What stays with me most when I think back on that evening isn't the slap itself, though my cheek carried a faint bruise for almost 2 weeks that I found myself touching absently more often than I meant to. It's the image of Tyler's shoulders bracing on that stage, the particular way a 17-year-old learns, in real time, in front of 400 strangers, that the adults in his life are capable of failing him even in the moments meant to belong entirely to him. I can't undo that image. No custody outcome, however just, changes what he saw or what it cost him to keep walking anyway. Diploma folder in hand, toward a stage he'd earned every right to cross without incident. Marcus and I have talked, since then, about how differently we might have handled the seating arrangements, the years of careful accommodation, the countless small moments where we chose the path that seemed least likely to create friction in the short term. I don't think either of us has landed on a version of the past where we could have seen this specific evening coming, and I've stopped trying to locate the exact moment we should have done something differently, because I think that search mostly just keeps the evening alive in a way that doesn't actually serve anyone, least of all Tyler, who has enough to carry without also managing his parents' retrospective guilt. I think, in the end, that's the part of this story I most want people to sit with, more than the vindication of watching Denise's own petition collapse under the weight of what she'd done. Consequences matter, and I'm not sorry the truth eventually became undeniable, recorded and witnessed and impossible to argue away. But consequences arriving afterward doesn't erase what happened before them. Tyler got both that evening, in the same 40 minutes. A father who defended me a second too late, and, later, a legal system that eventually got the facts right. I wish, more than almost anything else from that year, that he'd simply gotten to walk across a stage and shake a superintendent's hand without either one being necessary at all. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something I still think about. When the people who are supposed to protect a child instead give him a memory like that one, does it matter how thoroughly the consequences eventually catch up with the person responsible? Or is some damage simply done the moment it happens, regardless of what comes after? I don't think I've fully settled on my own answer, even now, months later. Tell me where you land on that, and tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I'd genuinely like to know how it reads from the outside. This story is a work of complete fiction, written for reflection rather than as an account of any real people or events, and it isn't meant to speak for anyone else's blended family, only to describe honestly what ours went through that year. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, so stay close, because we're just getting started.